Some royal dynasties shaped far more than a single country. The Habsburgs were one of them. For centuries, their influence stretched from the lowlands of Belgium to the borders of the Ottoman Empire, and from the forests of Bohemia to the shores of the Adriatic. Their family produced emperors, kings, and queens, and for a time, much of European politics revolved around decisions made by the Habsburg court. Then, during the autumn of 1918, that enormous system began to disintegrate. The crowns disappeared, the palaces were lost, the army dissolved, and the administrative structure of the Austro-Hungarian Empire came to an end. It seemed as though the Habsburg era had vanished forever, but the story did not end with the fall of the empire. The state disappeared, yet the family survived, moving through exile, financial hardship, political struggle, and a rapidly changing world. When Emperor Franz Joseph died in 1916, the throne passed to the 31-year-old Charles, known in German as Karl. He had not been prepared to become emperor. He was a relatively distant figure in the line of succession, but the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 suddenly pushed him toward the center of power. The First World War was already underway, and Charles inherited an empire that was fighting an external war while being torn apart by internal national tensions. The empire contained Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Slovenes, Italians, and many other communities. Food shortages, inflation, military defeats, and nationalist movements intensified the crisis. Charles attempted to explore the possibility of a separate peace with the Allied powers, but the secret effort was exposed. He was humiliated in front of his German allies, while the war continued. By late 1918, the army was collapsing, and different national groups were declaring independence one after another. Czechoslovakia emerged, the South Slavs formed a new political union, Poland reappeared as an independent state, and Hungary separated from the imperial structure. On November 12th, German Austria declared itself a republic. Charles announced that he would no longer participate in state affairs, but he refused to formally abdicate. That distinction would shape the rest of his life and the future of his family. That evening, Charles and his wife Zita left Schönbrunn Palace for the final time. They moved to an imperial hunting lodge, where the family lived under something close to house arrest. The building was cold, food was scarce, and the political situation was dangerous. There were genuine fears that the former emperor and his family might suffer the same fate as the Romanovs in Russia. A British officer was sent to help protect them, and his presence may have prevented a far worse outcome. In 1919, Austria's new parliament passed the Habsburg Law. This was more than a technical legal measure. It was an attempt to remove the old dynasty from public life. The law ended the sovereign rights of the Habsburg-Lorraine family, permanently barred Charles from returning to Austria, and transferred the dynasty's public property to the new republic. Palaces, royal collections, libraries, and state estates were no longer theirs. The family had already left Austria before the law took effect. In March 1919, they traveled to Switzerland on a former imperial train. As they crossed the border, Charles made it clear that he did not consider his claim to the throne extinguished. Switzerland allowed the family to remain, but political and security concerns forced them to move farther west. Their new residence beside Lake Geneva was comfortable by ordinary standards, yet their financial crisis continued to deepen. The annual allowance that had reportedly been promised to Charles never arrived. His family grew, private funds were limited, and the art objects and jewelry carried into exile had to be sold gradually. For a family that had lived for generations among royal institutions and state resources, sudden private poverty was a brutal transformation. Charles then decided to make another attempt to recover his crown. Hungary, unlike Austria, had not completely abolished the monarchy. Miklos Horthy served as regent, theoretically acting on behalf of the absent king. Charles believed that if he returned, the army and the public would support him. His first attempt in 1921 failed. Horthy argued that neighboring states would never accept a Habsburg restoration and might invade Hungary if it happened. Historians still debate whether Horthy sincerely feared such an outcome or simply refused to give up power. Either way, Charles was sent back to Switzerland. Later that year, he tried again with a more organized force. Several loyal soldiers joined him, and the group advanced toward Budapest. For a brief period, it appeared that the monarchy might actually be restored. Government forces, however, stopped the movement. Before the fighting could become worse, Charles surrendered. The Allied powers now regarded his presence in Central Europe as a potential source of instability. In November 1921, Charles, Zita, and their children were placed aboard a British warship and sent to Madeira, a remote Portuguese island in the Atlantic. It was not officially a prison, but it functioned as a form of open detention. The family initially stayed in an expensive hotel, then moved to a less costly villa in the hills. Damp weather, poor insulation, and a lack of money made their life increasingly difficult. Early in 1922, Charles became seriously ill. Bronchitis developed into pneumonia, and his weakened body could not fight the infection. In April 1922, at only 34 years of age, the last Habsburg emperor died. A man who had once ruled over millions was buried far from Vienna in a small church on a distant Atlantic island. Charles died when his eldest son Otto was only 9 years old. According to the family's tradition and beliefs, Zita told him that the responsibility of the dynasty now rested on his shoulders. It was an extraordinary burden for a child, but Otto was raised with the expectation that he would someday lead, even if there was no longer a kingdom for him to govern. Zita proved to be a remarkably strong figure. Widowed at a young age, she raised 8 children while moving between countries and trying to keep the family safe. Otto was educated according to the old standards of the Austro-Hungarian court. He studied several languages, received a strict religious education, and developed a deep interest in history and politics. The family eventually settled in the Basque region of Spain, where a group of Spanish aristocrats helped arrange a home for them. Otto matured into a serious and disciplined young man. He studied in Belgium and earned a doctorate in political and social sciences in 1935. At the same time, a new danger was spreading across Europe: Adolf Hitler. To Hitler, the Habsburg legacy represented a multilingual, multinational Catholic vision of Europe, the exact opposite of Nazi racial nationalism. When Germany's plan to absorb Austria became clear, Otto offered to return from exile and take over the Austrian government as a symbol of resistance. The Austrian leadership rejected the idea, fearing that a Habsburg restoration would provoke an even more aggressive response from Hitler. In March 1938, German forces entered Austria, and the country was incorporated into Nazi Germany. The Habsburg law was restored, the family's property was confiscated, and Otto was sentenced to death in absentia. He escaped Europe, while several relatives who remained behind were caught in Nazi persecution. Their homes, books, artworks, and personal possessions were seized. The Habsburg name itself was treated as a political threat. Otto eventually reached the United States and began working to secure international support for Austria. He appealed to President Franklin Roosevelt and other Allied leaders, arguing that Austria should be understood as a victim of Nazi aggression rather than simply as a willing partner. He maintained contacts with major political figures and used the diplomatic reach of his family name for a new purpose. When the war ended in 1945, Austria was liberated, but the Habsburgs were not welcomed back. The post-war government kept the anti-Habsburg legislation in place. The 1955 treaty that restored Austrian sovereignty also required the country to maintain restrictions against a monarchical restoration. Otto was the head of one of Europe's oldest dynasties, yet he still could not freely enter the country his family had ruled for centuries. In 1961, Otto made a difficult decision. He formally renounced his dynastic claims and declared himself a loyal citizen of the Austrian Republic. For monarchists, this was a painful compromise. But Otto understood that his influence would not come from trying to restore a vanished throne. It would come from helping shape the future of Europe. Even after the declaration, it took years before he was allowed to return. In 1966, he finally received an Austrian passport and, after nearly half a century, stepped onto Austrian soil again. The visit was private, but its symbolism was enormous. A family once expelled by law was now returning as part of the Republic's civic life. Otto devoted himself to European integration. In his view, the most valuable part of the Habsburg legacy was its recognition that different languages, cultures, and peoples could exist within a common political framework. The imperial model had failed, but cooperation among Central European nations could be rebuilt through democratic institutions. He joined the Pan-European movement and later became its president. After receiving German citizenship, he ran for the European Parliament and served there from 1979 to 1999. Inside Parliament, he placed an empty chair in the chamber to represent the Eastern European countries trapped behind the Iron Curtain. His most famous role came in connection with the Pan-European Picnic of 1989. The event took place near the Austrian-Hungarian border and was intended as a symbolic demonstration of peace and East-West cooperation. For a few hours, the border gate was to be opened. But the news spread among East German tourists staying in Hungary, and hundreds of people rushed across the border when the gate opened. The guards did not fire. They stepped aside and allowed the people to pass. The event had consequences far beyond what its organizers expected. Hungary later opened its borders more fully, and the flow of East Germans into the West accelerated. Within months, the Berlin Wall fell, and communist rule across Eastern Europe began to collapse. Otto, The heir to a throne that no longer existed had helped weaken the system that had divided the continent for decades. Otto remained involved in European affairs after leaving the European Parliament. He died in Bavaria in 2011. His funeral brought together the traditions of the old dynasty and the realities of modern Europe. He was buried in Vienna's Capuchin Church, inside the imperial crypt where generations of Habsburg rulers had been laid to rest. The traditional entrance ceremony was performed. First, his full titles and lineage were announced. From inside the church came the response that the person at the door was not known. The titles were repeated, but the answer remained the same. Only when he was described as an ordinary, sinful human being seeking God's mercy did the doors open. The ritual carried a simple message. No matter how powerful a person may be, death reduces every title to humanity. After Otto, leadership of the family passed to his son, Karl. The modern Habsburg family no longer resembles a royal court ruling from a palace. Karl studied law, philosophy, and politics, served briefly in the European Parliament, and later dedicated himself to protecting cultural heritage. From 2008 to 2020, he served as president of Blue Shield International, an organization that protects historic monuments and cultural property during wars, disasters, and crises. The younger generation has also pursued modern careers rather than traditional royal roles. Members of the family have entered sports, business, the arts, and public life. Their transformation shows that a dynasty without a state does not have to become a museum piece. A family can carry its name, education, and social connections into entirely new fields. The question of Habsburg wealth remains difficult to answer. The 1919 law confiscated public royal property, but private assets, personal investments, and property belonging to individual family branches were not necessarily treated in exactly the same way. As a result, estimates of the family's total wealth vary widely and are difficult to verify. What is easier to observe is that their influence is not limited to money. Their presence continues through cultural institutions, religious traditions, philanthropy, public life, and long-standing social networks. A family once expelled from Austria was eventually allowed to participate in the Republic as ordinary citizens and, under later legal changes, to qualify for public office. It was a remarkable reversal of history. The religious recognition of Charles of Austria added another layer to the family story. The Catholic Church honored his efforts to pursue peace during the First World War and his religious conduct during exile. A continuing canonization process has kept his name relevant within Catholic circles. Reports about the preservation of his remains decades after his death also contributed to the legend surrounding him, although the Church has been careful not to define the matter as a miracle. The Habsburg story is not compelling simply because the family was once powerful. The deeper question is what happened after power disappeared. The empire was gone, the official property was lost, the family was exiled, and there were periods of genuine financial hardship. Yet each generation found a new way to remain relevant. Zita kept the family together. Otto turned the idea of Central European cooperation into a political mission. Karl worked to protect cultural heritage. Later generations entered professional fields that had nothing to do with monarchy. The family did not restore the old empire, and over time, they largely stopped trying. Instead, they carried one of its central ideas into a new age, that the peoples of Central Europe could gain more through cooperation than through conflict. The end of political power does not always mean the end of influence. Sometimes a family loses its throne but preserves its identity, purpose, and public role. The Habsburgs lost their empire in 1918, but they did not allow themselves to become relics locked inside a history book. They adapted. They replaced royal power with public service, palaces with institutions, and dynastic ambition with political and cultural engagement. That may be the most important lesson of their story. When an entire world collapses, what truly survives? Money, property, and titles can disappear. What remains is conviction, purpose, and the ability to become useful in a new era. The Habsburg experience offers one possible answer. An empire ended, but a family found a new place in the world. The scepter gave way to ideas, the palace gave way to institutions, and the throne gave way to public service. That is why, more than a century after the empire turned to dust, the Habsburg name has not completely disappeared from European history, culture, or politics. If you enjoy stories about forgotten dynasties and hidden chapters of history, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment in the Habsburg story affected you the most. I'll see you in the next story.